Welcome everybody to our talk about invasive alien species, focusing on flora. So I'm Tamsin, I'm the events coordinator at Majjistral Park, and we've been organising these online talks once a month because we can't do live events at the moment for now, but hopefully these online talks are interesting for everybody. So just to let you know, we're going to keep questions and comments to the end, so you can feel free to ask things at the end of the talk. There is the chat function. I'll try and keep up with it as much as possible, but you can post questions there. And just to let you know that the session is being recorded, so if you don't want to be in the video, you can keep your video off and ask a question, or like I said, you can type it to us. And the duration should be round about an hour. We might go over by a little bit, but roughly an hour or a bit over that. So I'll introduce our guest speaker for tonight. If everybody could keep it on mute, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Our guest speaker tonight, I'm honoured to have Mr. Sami Vella with us. He's he represents with Ain Zaytuna and does a lot of work with them in Maliha, and he's also on the board of Majjistral Park. And he's going to take us first through what we should do and shouldn't do with invasive species, and then go through a few of the invasive species and tell us a bit more about them. So I'll hand over to you now, Sami, if that's okay.
Thank you, Tamsin. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I hope you will enjoy it, and I hope we will all learn from this event. The aim of this talk is to make everything are not just in themselves, but how they impact on our environment, and especially on our indigenous flora. So we'll try to make it as succinct as possible, because it is a very wide-ranging theme, but we'll go through the main points as quickly as possible, and at the end we'll also bring up images of the main invasive alien species that are of concern in Malta. So we have a whole list of the invasive alien species. The main ones are about 26 to 30. We'll look at those at the very end, but right now we have a brief summary of what we're going to talk about, and that's the main invasive alien species, the harm that these species do, control and removal of these species, and at the end, Tamsin will also add her own part, her own talk about invasive alien species at Majjistral Park. Just this slide, you should keep this because you have there the main documents that will help you go into further depth on this topic, and those are documents which you find online by Planning Authority and ERA now. The first one is about the Malta National Biodiversity Strategy, which also includes control of alien species. And the second one is actually a document which shows the main invasive species, why they are of concern, how to manage them, and how to control them or limit them and possibly eradicate them. What are invasive alien species? I've taken this definition straight from the ERA site, from the State of the Environment report of 2018. And it says invasive alien species are non-native species that deliberately or accidentally enter by human action and can potentially spread and possibly outcompete local biodiversity and therefore become invasive. These invasive alien species can have detrimental consequences and are one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. And when we say that they are deliberately or accidentally entered by human action, that specifies that when a plant spreads into a new plant spreads into our territory because of climate change or because the conditions have changed and enable it naturally to enter, that's not considered as an invasive alien species. That is a natural progression. But when it is deliberately or accidentally brought into the country by human action, then yes, it's invasive alien species. Now, when we talk about non-native and alien, not all non-native species are invasive. Most of them find it difficult to survive in our environment without lots of tender loving care. For example, potted plants, which we buy from nurseries, most of them, the majority of them, will simply die very quickly unless you really take good care of them. And also many of our crop species are not indigenous. They are imported or they have been imported previously, and unless they are properly cultivated and taken care of, they will also not succeed. But some species come from countries with similar climates as ours, and these can wreak havoc in our ecosystems. What problems do invasive alien species cause? They can spread rapidly through seed dispersal by animals, birds, small mammals, insects, including ants. They can spread through water, for example, when it rains, and they float downstream with the rainwater, or else when we move soil or excavate soil and move it elsewhere, then we're spreading these. And also a lot of them have seeds which can be airborne. They have these little parachutes or wings, and they manage to ride the currents and emigrate downstream or upstream in other areas which before had not been affected by them. Then there are vegetative or mechanical means. In other words, parts of the plant are broken off and they're carried to other areas, either deliberately. We actually plant them sometimes because we think they're beautiful or they're nice or they're useful. Some of them are carried by animals, like they stick to dogs and cats' furs or to birds' feathers. And sometimes they're carried by mechanical means, like a truck or a car goes over them, they stick to the tires or they stick to the body of the car, and then we move elsewhere and they are knocked off and they start propagating elsewhere. There are migration mechanisms aided by other types of vectors, such as, like we said, cars, farm machinery. They escape from cultivation, such as from agriculture, horticulture, forestation, and plantations. I mean, forestation, we know that we made a lot of mistakes back in the 70s and the 80s when there was this big drive to try to afforest Malta because we became conscious that the island had become so bare. And we started planting a lot of trees which are actually invasive and alien, like acacia and like eucalyptus and others. And it was only later that we realized that we were making a big mistake. And then now from those cultivations, they're spreading elsewhere. So, and things like acacia, like we'll see later on, it can spread very rapidly and it's very difficult to contain. They escape from ornamental plantings, such as from botanic, public, and private gardens, and other plantings, such as along streets or from landscaped areas. We see every day a lot of public gardens, center strips, roundabouts. They are planted, full of alien species, and of course they are well taken care of, and so they are successful, and they flower and they seed and then they spread elsewhere. And of course there's natural, unaided spread. Like I said before, seeds that float on the air birds eating the seeds and then defecating and spreading them elsewhere, ants carrying them elsewhere, and even some mammals who feed on their leaves and then they spread them somewhere else. And they can elbow out indigenous species. So they don't just spread, but they push our own indigenous species out of competition. How? Well, they could be more aggressive than our local species. They could be more resistant to arid conditions, like we already mentioned, the Acacia and the Eucalyptus. They're very, very resistant to arid conditions. They could be more resistant to existing parasites. They could be more easily propagated. For example, they produce more seeds, or their seeds can germinate more efficiently, or they can reproduce through cuttings or through bulbs, and therefore they are more competitive in propagation than our local indigenous communities. And something else, psychological. They can be more superficially attractive to the general public. So people will tend to prefer them to plant in their gardens, like we've seen with our landscape companies. They prefer them in planting them in center strips and in roundabouts and in public gardens. So they will actually be given an advantage over the indigenous specimens and therefore then multiply very, very rapidly. They can also cause species contamination. Some invasive alien species are related to indigenous species. They belong to the same genus or sometimes to the same species. There are different varieties of the same species, but usually they're from the same genus. And therefore, they could interact with local species and produce hybrids, which could then dominate and replace the original indigenous species. More problems caused by invasive alien species. They could dominate a particular landscape and change it permanently. Sometimes we find that there are areas that have been degraded or have been completely abandoned, and there's the original vegetation has been destroyed, sometimes because a whole area has been targeted for dumping, especially construction waste. And then these alien species colonize the area, and they take over that whole landscape, and they dominate it totally. And therefore, that changes our natural indigenous landscape. They could serve as vectors for new parasites and pathogens. For example, they could carry into the country with them certain parasites and pathogens, and then spread it over to our indigenous populations. Their roots could be so aggressive that they damage roads, pavements, sewage pipes, and other buried services. They could release allelopathic chemicals, which inhibit the germination and growth of our indigenous species. For example, we know that the acacia and the eucalyptus, they release these allelopathic compounds into the soil, and they inhibit anything from growing underneath them. And that will take time then to repair. Even if you uproot the tree, if you destroy it completely, those chemicals will be there for some time, and it will be some time before you can actually plant something new there, unless you clean the soil completely. They could also flower at different periods from local species, and therefore extend the season of allergies and hay fever, exacerbating the condition of susceptible individuals. They could also starve other plant communities of existing soil moisture and nutrients because of their extensive root systems, for example, eucalyptus and acacia. We often notice only the positive impacts of these alien species. For example, we look at their visual beauty. Yes, some of them are very pretty, beautiful flowers. They also help to green streets and country roads. They grow very rapidly, and therefore they are seen as an advantage by certain well, individuals or groups of people like hunters who want to have their trees growing fast so that they can have these hunting hides, or they are used for privacy, and therefore, because they grow rapidly, they are found to be very useful because you can screen your garden very quickly, and also for security, for using hedges which keep animals and other people out. They could also serve as summer forage for ruminants. As you know, in Malta, we have a very long summer, and in summertime, forage for goats and sheep is, well, non-existent, basically. Yeah, we have to feed them dry forage, which we import. And so some of them, for example, the prickly pear, which is considered an invasive alien. The leaves of the prickly pear are chopped up and fed to these ruminants so that they can have some green forage. The flowers of the prickly pear are found useful for bees as well, but not just the prickly pear. I mean, some of these species, these alien species, bloom in autumn. For example, the eucalyptus, when there is nothing else in bloom, and therefore beekeepers find the eucalyptus to be very providential because it provides blossoms in autumn, early autumn, when they can't find anything else to forage on. They could also be found useful for provision of timber from unprotected trees. So somebody wants some wood for a fireplace or to make a rough bench or something. They say, oh, this is an alien tree, it's unprotected, so I can chop it down. So they find it useful from that, in that sense. Very often people only see the positive impacts of these alien species and fail to see the threats that are provided by these species. Each invasive species that takes root is taking the place of an indigenous species. We have a very limited area in Malta. We are not a country like Africa or like the United States or Australia, where we have huge spreads of land. We have very limited space left for our environment. Already, at least 1/3 of the country has been totally built up. In Europe, we are the country with the highest proportion of territory that has been built up. So, and we are the country with the least amount proportionally, not just in, just in area, but proportionally, the least left for the environment. And most of that is taken up by agriculture. So we can't afford to lose even a square foot of land to these species. So each alien species that takes root is taking the place. They need to be recovered. So we can't afford to have this. If an alien species becomes established, it may spread and eliminate many more of our species. Our landscape could be totally transformed and an entire ecosystem could be subverted and destroyed. Subversion of indigenous communities. Our indigenous plants are an integral part of our landscape. A whole web of living organisms, including ourselves, depend on these plants for food, for homes, shelter from heat, from cold, from wind, from predators. Each indigenous plant, shrub, tree is part of our identity. It has a story to tell about what we are, who we are, where we come from, where we're going. It offers us a compass so we can understand our place on this planet. Each alien invasive tells us nothing about ourselves except negative things. It doesn't say anything about ourselves to us and not to anybody else. It is not a signpost on our way like our indigenous species are. It is diversion. It is a red herring, luring us away from our natural path. Now, some problems caused by invasive alien species. Some more problems. Some alien species are actually very toxic. People are often unaware of this toxicity. Most Maltese know that the indigenous oleander, Nerium oleander, is toxic and warn their children about it because they know about it. But when a new species is introduced, like, for example, Tevetia peruviana, they just admire its glossy leaves, its resistance to drought, and its delightful flowers. They do not realize that every part of the plant is so toxic that it has caused many deaths in its native country. Cultural harm. We have already lost too many of our indigenous species. Some have dwindled to a few specimens. There is no room for tolerance of alien species, let alone invasive alien species. A lot of hard work needs to be done to recover indigenous populations so that they could once again become independently sustainable. We've often forgotten the Maltese names of many of them. These names and the cultural associations deriving from them are important pieces of our cultural puzzle. So how do we go forward? Well, we start by putting together an invasive alien species control and removal program. Rule number 1, prevention better than cure. I'm sure you've heard of that before. Get smart, become informed, be aware of the most problematic invasive alien species and steer away from them. Don't buy them, don't plant them, don't propagate them, do not tolerate them. Do your part to alert others about them. Offer to exchange them for indigenous species, and then destroy them. Rule number 2, know your enemy. You need to know which plants are aliens and invasive. You must also be able to distinguish them from indigenous species that are related to them and may resemble them to various degrees. You also need to be able to recognize them when they have just sprouted, because that's when it's easiest to eradicate them and thus contain their spread. Control and removal in the wild. Make sure you know exactly what you're doing before you take any initiative. You could be doing more harm than good. Familiarize yourself with official methodologies endorsed by ERA, and consult ERA and obtain approval before you start anything. I'm making an emphasis on this because it's not so straightforward. Once an alien invasive species has become established, especially in the wild, I mean, if it's in your private garden, then it's much easier. If it's in a Lentis strip, it's much easier. But in the wild, in nature, there are probably other indigenous species growing around it. And therefore, if you simply go in and just pull it up, you're probably pulling up and destroying other indigenous species as well. Where that plant has become established for quite some time, then even the surrounding flora and fauna might have become acclimatized to that particular species. And therefore, you could be destroying habitat of other species when you pull it up. So you need to know what you are doing, and you need to consult the competent authorities before you start any initiative. And therefore, that will help you to put together a methodology that will only harm the alien species and not harm any indigenous ones. Now, some invasive species will shed thousands of seeds if they are removed carelessly. For example, the fountain grass. You can see that it's got so many thousands of seeds that if you simply just dig it up, especially when the seeds are mature, you're going to spread those seeds all over the place. And while you're going to pick out just one clump, you're actually helping to spread another 1,000 plants. So you have to know how to handle it. For example, sometimes you have to put a plastic bag on the plant first and then cut it up so that it will be contained in the plastic bag. There are different methodologies for the different plants, and those documents I mentioned before will indicate to you how you should go around it or how you should not go around it. So please also refer to those documents when you have the time, because they have a lot of details that will help you to remove or contain or limit these alien species. Removal could also damage roots of adjacent indigenous species, like we said before. Drastic removal initiatives could denude the whole area and cause soil erosion and habitat destruction, affecting other biota. So we really have to be very careful how we go about it. Now we've come to the point where we're actually talking about the actual species, and we start with our first one. We have the acacia. Most people are aware that the acacia has spread throughout the Maltese Islands. It has become a headache. We have three actually species of acacia. We have Acacia cyclops, we have Acacia Acacia Kangaroo, and we have also the blue wattle, the Acacia. Here we are. Just to start off with, what does acacia mean? It comes from a Greek word meaning thorny tree, akakia. You'll find that in many plant names, we have switched the K sound into a C, a soft C sound. Okay, but in fact, the original name was akakia, and the AK prefix usually means a thorn. Okay, like acanthus means something having a thorn. So it's a Greek word that means a thorny tree, because the first acacia trees that were known were the trees growing in the desert. You'll find reference to them in the Bible even, and those have very large vicious thorns, which fits perfect in our case because it has become a thorn in our side. The genus includes 1,300 species, about, but over in Malta here we are concerned with just these three species. Acacia salinea, and salinea means willow-like because it has leaves that droop down like a weeping willow, and so the name comes from that. We have Acacia cyclops. Cyclops means one eye, and it comes from the seeds, because the seeds are surrounded by a red circumference, which makes it look like it's called one eye or a red eye. In fact, sometimes it is called red eye acacia. And you have Acacia Kangaroo, and Kangaroo means desert. That's the one with the large spines. So Acacia Kangaroo is actually acacia from the desert. And this displays very, very vicious thorns. Now, Acacia salinea and Acacia cyclops were propagated in great numbers back in the 70s and 80s. Most of us are aware of how much energy was placed into planting as many of these acacia trees all over the islands. Children in schools were given seeds to propagate them at home, and there were competitions between schools to see who would actually propagate the most of these acacia trees. And we actually spread these acacias all over the islands, and we did the same with the eucalyptus as well. Unfortunately, the species is highly resistant to eradication. Cutting down will result in almost immediate eradication. Requires laborious residues. The removal of the residues is important because there will be a lot of seeds there. You know that they can, very soon afterwards you'll see new ones growing up. but also the acacia leaves behind it these allelopathic residues, these chemicals that inhibit germination of seeds, and therefore, unless you actually take all the debris from that area, then that area will remain infertile for quite some time. So this is the an image of the Akasha Kangaroo. You can see the very large spines. By the way, the spines, many people think that it's there to inhibit animals from grazing on it. But the main reason for those spines is that they collect moisture. So in the desert, usually when there is no rain for many months, at nighttime there is condensation of dew, and that dew collects on these spines and then flows down to the branch, and from the branch down to the trunk and to the roots. So actually, this tree has acclimatized itself to that environment and manages to water itself with nightly condensation. That's the main aim of those thorns. Acacia salinea, you can see how this tree has got all these branches flowing downwards like the weeping willow. You can also see the massive bunches of flowers it produces, and all of those will become seeds and therefore very quickly repropagates. Our second plant is the Ionum Arboretum. We've seen these in many house gardens. It used to be very popular because it's very easy to propagate. It actually produces lots of seeds, but also each part of the plant can take root. Even the leaves, you just pluck a few of the leaves and you put them in the soil and they will take root. So they can spread very easily. It has various names. In Maltese, Widnetel Cully is just one of them, but it has many other names. But it is an invasive plant. It's not indigenous, and unless we're very careful with it, it will spread very quickly. So if you do have one in your garden because you think it's useful, it doesn't need any care, it can take care of itself, and you like its blooms, make sure you don't plant it outside in the wild. You make sure you don't plant it in the center strips or in roundabouts from where it can then escape and spread elsewhere. The agave, we've seen these in many areas along the coast road, etc. We still see people who should know better using them in their landscape schemes. It's very convenient because you'll plant it. It doesn't need any care whatsoever, and it will reproduce itself. It will multiply and fill up a whole area, and so your landscape work is done. But you can't get rid of it because it'll live for a long time. Most of these will take about 10 years before they flower. And although once they flower, they die, in the meantime, they have produced a lot of side shoots, which then fill up the whole area. And also, they are very vicious plants. The leaves are serrated. It's very dangerous to work with them. So eradicating them means a lot of work. You have to really go equipped with a lot of protective clothing and with large tools, and it takes a lot of energy to remove it. So again, in this case, prevention is better than cure. This is another agave, the sisal one. This one that make hemp, that they make sacks from. So in other countries, it's useful. There are industries based on it. In Malta, it's just a big headache. Ailanthus altissima, also known as the tree of heaven. Yeah, again, this one tree that people say, oh, how pretty it is, when it's those red blooms, those crimson blooms. and the fern leaves. They've been planting them along the roadsides. Every new road that has been opened, you see them being planted because they grow very quickly. They can resist the drought, the aridity of our climate, and soon at the height of summer, you'll see them blooming. So people think they're very pretty, but they produce a lot of seeds. Birds carry those seeds, and they can spread very rapidly to other areas.
Sorry, Sammy, I've clicked on mute on your name by accident. Okay, I think you're fine now.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Aptenia species, ice plant. This one is called either Woodnettle Hanzir or Woodnettle Jordina Maltese. There is a different variety that's called Runel Batra, but in English they're all called ice plants. This spreads very, very easily. Each part of it, each leaf, each stem will actually propagate by itself. It also produces seeds, so it can be spread by seeds. And to remove it, usually what we have to do, because this produces, so you start cutting up the one end and you start rolling it up like a carpet. And you put it in a plastic bag and you compost it on the plastic so that it dies, it rots. If you compost it on the plastic, it will rot. It's got a lot of juices in them, a lot of moisture in it, and therefore it will rot very quickly. So once you actually take the trouble of removing it carefully, leaving not a part of it in place, then it can be controlled and eradicated. Okay, our giant reed or Arundodonyx, Asbagbira. It's called Asbagbira Maltese because indigenously we have other forms of reeds, Asbazyra, okay, and that was the original one. That was a reed that was here before we arrived, but eventually this giant reed was introduced, mainly because, of course, it grows faster, it's more robust, and it is used for lots of things. A lot of cane work. It is used as windbreaks. It's, as we know, it's used to produce our traditional Maltese hasira, the cane curtains that we have in front of our village houses. We use it to create shelters from the sun. And it was found industrially to be very useful. But it is very aggressive. It absorbs a lot of moisture. So wherever it takes root, it destroys everything else. It smothers everything else. And it takes up all the soil moisture, so nothing else will grow there. But it has become acclimatized. It has become naturalized in Malta. It's been here for hundreds of years now, and it's going to be very difficult to eradicate because certain landscapes are now dominated by it, and removing it totally, which is very difficult because it spreads through its rhizomes from the ground, is very laborious. But if you do that, you're going to have to be ready to replace it with something else. And in some areas, unfortunately, we have had indigenous fauna species like the freshwater crab, who has made its home underneath its roots. So, for example, if you go to Bahria, the watercourse there, the freshwater crab exists only in burrows underneath the roots of this giant reed. So uprooting all those will actually destroy the habitat on which this freshwater crab depends. So this is one particular instance where control or eradication must be done very carefully with constant consultation with the competent authorities like ERA to make sure that we do not actually do more damage than we are doing good. But at least we should start to learn that not to spread it any further. Unfortunately, there are people who still love this cane, this reed, and actually are spreading it, are planting it elsewhere, either to screen their land or else to produce windbreaks, or just to have the reed to use it to manufacture stuff from it. Symphyotricum squamatus, Aster squamatus. This has started to spread very rapidly. Sometimes it looks very attractive because in summertime you see patches of it that are green, whereas all the other plants have dried up. It spreads and produces a whole carpet and seeds very quickly. So and of course the seeds float on the air and spread to other areas. So we have to be very careful. First of all, not simply to look at the aesthetic side of it, and also to be able to distinguish it from local indigenous plants that resemble it. Cardiospermum grandiflorum with the balloon vine. This has become a real headache. It looks beautiful. If you cultivate it and you see it growing, you say, oh, wonderful, you know, it grows very quickly. It will cover a wall, an ugly wall. So it can disguise some ugliness, but it grows so fast and it climbs on other trees, on other plants. It smothers them. It produces copious seeds in this balloon form. And so when it drops those balloons, any rainwater that might be happening, it will float on that water and it will carry downstream and then, of course, germinate elsewhere. But even without that, once those balloons open, what you have inside are seeds with a parachute. So if that bursts open, any current of air will simply take up these seeds and float them elsewhere, and they will spread even miles away. So it is of very high concern. You can see on the right-hand side what it will do to other vegetation. It will smother it completely, and we actually have that right now in quite a few protected areas. I've been recently in Witolea, where a lot of work has been done by NGOs to plant many indigenous trees there, and I've seen many of them smothered completely with this balloon plant. So it's really become a destructive agent. Our famous Suabat al-Madonna, I mean, I always say it should have been called Suabat al-Shitan, I mean, not al-Madonna, because it's really a very invasive plant. It's in its native country, it's a useful plant. It actually produces fruits that are edible. In fact, it's called the Hottentot Fig. It comes, of course, from South Africa. But it spreads very, very easily, produces seeds. The fruits are full of seeds, like a real fig. But also, each part of it, each little stem will take root. And originally, many people found it very useful, very handy, because you just take a few stems, you plant them, they take root, and suddenly you have a patch in your garden which was bare and it's covered with all this green stuff that doesn't need any care, doesn't need even any watering, and it produces not only green stuff, but also nice flowers. So like I said in the beginning, it can be considered to be a very attractive plant, but actually it can be very destructive because it will encroach on indigenous species, on areas which were before dominated by indigenous species, and will actually elbow them out, and will of course take up all the moisture in the place, and become the dominant, in fact the only species in that area. Fortunately, it's not that difficult to control if we are careful about it. It's a bit like we said before with the Aptenia, with the ice plant. You start off, you remove one end of where it is, and you start rolling it over like a carpet, and you take it in plastic bags and you compost it, making sure it doesn't take root elsewhere. Make sure that where you remove it, you pick up all the little bits, you leave nothing behind, because each little bit that you leave will take root again and start off again. Our Casuarina equisitifolia is an interesting name. The name comes from the cassowary, which, you know, it's a large flightless bird, and the branches, the way the branches are placed, resemble a bit the ends of the cassowary's wings. So they're called it Casuarina. And equisitifolia, it means that the leaves, these long leaves, look like the horsetail. So that's where the name comes from. But of course, it's an alien plant. In fact, in English, it's called Australian pine, but it's indigenous not just to Australia, but also to Indonesia and that area of Asia. And over here, it has been very successful. It grows very, very quickly. It produces a lot of these seed pods, which actually afterwards open up, and there are these little seeds with wings on them, and they just float on the air, and they're carried elsewhere, and they sprout, and so it spreads also very rapidly. And it's also a bit like the eucalyptus and the acacia. It is very moisture hungry. It takes up all the moisture in the area, and also releases these allelopathic compounds which prevent anything else from sprouting underneath it. It was originally considered to be an attractive tree because of its rapid growth, because it's also a conifer, and it produces nice shade. But wherever it's planted, it takes over and inhibits the growth of other trees, and especially it inhibits the growth of indigenous species. The eucalyptus, again, this plant has, we have some controversies over it because we have certain specimens that have been here for, well, probably 100 years. They have grown to very large size. Even cutting them down is problematic because you're going to need equipment, even a crane, to cut it down in small portions first. You can't just chop it down because it'll destroy everything around it once it falls. But also beekeepers, for example, find it very useful because this one blooms around September. And therefore it blooms at a time when bees find nothing else to forage on. And so actually some people are planting them. Some are planting them to facilitate their hunting hobbies because they grow very quickly, and they provide shelter for migratory birds. In fact, in Maltese it's called Sijrata Gamim, so it's related directly to the turtle doves. So hunters find it useful. Landscapists used to find it useful, and beekeepers find it useful. But this tree takes up so much moisture that it starves everything else around it from that moisture and from those nutrients. It has a rooting system that spreads on the surface or just below the surface, because that enables it also to make use of moisture from the dew, from any condensation that occurs at night. And that's how it has survived. But that means that wherever the roots spread, it actually wipes out everything else, and it's very difficult then to eradicate it. The seeds sprout very easily, so it is very easy to propagate itself. And I've seen some valleys, like Mistra Valley, for example, the watercourse is completely dominated by these eucalyptus trees. Yes, at least let's be careful and not plant any more of them. Lantana Camara. Yes, so we've seen this. Of course, this was for several decades very popular as an ornamental shrub. It was planted it's still planted in many public gardens, in many private gardens, along center strips. It needs no care. It'll take care of itself. It drinks up all the moisture as well. It flowers abundantly and seeds abundantly. And if you come to control it, then you have to be careful how to do it, because the stems are full of these curved thorns. So you have to go with lots of protective clothing. You have to use good gloves, and you have to use proper tools if you're going to cut it down. And if you're cutting it down, you must make sure that you collect every bit of it, because it will also self-propagate from cuttings. So if you cut it down and you're carrying the stuff and you drop some of it, it will take root and start again. And also the seeds are eaten by birds and then are carried off elsewhere. And so it starts again in other areas. So yes, it looks like a very pretty plant, lots of color. And of course, we miss those colors. And it remains green even when it's hot. So we have some greenery in summer, but it's taking the place of our indigenous species. And we have many indigenous species who can compete with all these plants, both in greenery and in color, if we take care of them. Localia leucocephala, the white lead tree, white popinac. It's also quite popular because of its appearance. It's a fern, or it looks like a fern. It's got these nice white flowers, produces copious seeds with pods, and therefore propagates itself very, very quickly. It is drought resistant, so it's actually also very green when all around us in summer we see a lot of dryness and aridity. So it's one of the factors that contributes to its popularity, but we have to resist these superficial attractive factors and realize that it's taking over our indigenous species. And there are a lot of efforts right now to propagate our indigenous species. A lot of work is being done by many organizations and many volunteers to start propagating our indigenous species. And let's make sure that we don't continue to spread these alien invasives, so that we'll have areas where we can plant all these indigenous species that we are propagating. Nicotiana glauca, a citrus tobacco or sweet tobacco. Nicotiana is obvious because nicotine, tobacco, right? And glauca simply means blue or gray blue, you know? So it's got these grayish blue leaves. It's basically means the blue tobacco tree. But as you can see, it produces lots of flowers. Those flowers mean lots of seeds, and it propagates itself very, very quickly. It grows very quickly. And although so far its spread has not been that rapid, But if we keep on allowing it to spread further, of course, then it will dominate certain landscapes, especially degraded or neglected areas, or areas which had been completely disrupted, and now or there have been dumpings there. You'll find that it'll take over in those places, and it's very opportunistic. It finds a niche, it will sprout there. There's another headache. Notoscardum gracile. It's like a false garlic. It's called fragrant false garlic because the flowers actually smell sweet. But it's impossible to eradicate. It's possible to control. I've got it in my garden, I know. It produces so many bulbs, very small bulbs or bulbils, and the roots. This is a close up of it in the garden. It looks something like this. And if you have a patch like that, you try to dig it up, and you'll find that in the mother bulb there are at least another 100 very small bulbs. And as you dig it out, all these little bulbs will just fall off, and they're so small it's almost impossible to pick them all up. I have tried. I've even used a sieve to sieve the soil and to collect the bulbs. And within 2 months, that area was again full of these false garlic. And they just take over. They spread very quickly, and they flower very quickly, and they seed from the flowers, and they propagate also from beneath, from the bulbs. So if you have one of them in your garden, get rid of it before it reproduces, because afterwards you're going to find it difficult to eradicate. Our famous prickly pears. This is another tree that there's controversy about it now because it is an invasive alien, but it was introduced a long time ago by the Knights. As we know, this comes from Mexico and was brought back into Europe after Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas. Originally, this plant was brought over not for the fruit, not for the fodder that can produce, but actually because of a small insect, the cochineal, that lives off it, and it produces a red dye. In those days, there were no chemical dyes. So if you wanted a coloring agent, you had to produce it from flowers or from fruit or from the bark of trees, like the pomegranates, for example. But the red color was very important because of the color of power. In fact, cardinals wore red, kings wore red, emperors wore red, and soldiers wore red. Soldiers wore red not because they were powerful, but because if they have red uniform, the blood won't show. So red was an important color that was much sought after, and they could produce this red color from this insect, this small insect that feeds off this tree. And that is the reason why it was brought back in Europe. Later on, they discovered that the fruit was also delicious. In summertime, it's very, very refreshing. And also, they discovered that the leaves can be cut down and fed to ruminants as fodder. As you know, in places like Malta and in North Africa, in summertime, there is very little fodder available. And so to keep these ruminants going, they fed the goats and sheep with these leaves, which they cut up and fed them to. But now it's become part of our heritage. So what do you do? It can be grown as an agricultural crop, but unfortunately, since it doesn't need much care, it's allowed to spread. And if you allow it to spread, it can spread to natural areas and overtake other indigenous species It is, of course, also very moisture hungry, so it'll take up all the moisture, but not only the moisture. Its roots also very surface roots, so it will spread its roots on the surface very quickly, taking up moisture and taking up nutrients. So it will starve out every other plant that is growing nearby. So what do? We destroy it completely? I can't say that because it's become part of our agricultural produce. And in early summer, when it starts flowering, bees are foraging of its flowers very often. In autumn, when there's nothing else to forage on, the split and overripe fruits also provide the forage for the bees and for many birds. You find many migratory birds feeding off these leftover prickly pears. And of course, the leaves are still being used as fodder for animals as well. So total destruction, I wouldn't advise that. But yes, control it. Don't let it spread into the natural environment. Anywhere where it's growing, where it's just a nature reserve, apart from agricultural areas, remove it and plant something else. After all, many of our indigenous plants produce berries and produce fruits, which are also very good feed and very good forage for many of our insects and birds and other fauna. Yes, the Cape sorrel, the Hashish anglisa. Scientific name Oxalis Pescapre. The oxalis, of course, because it has got a lot of oxalic acid in it. And Pescapre means goat foot, actually, because the leaves, the shape of the leaves resemble a lot the footprint of a goat, or at least that's how they thought about it when they gave it the name. The problem is that, of course, it has become ubiquitous. I mean, it's all over our island. It's called Hashish anglisa, as you know, because it was introduced by an English lady who was coming from South Africa. She brought it with her, and because actually it's indigenous to South Africa. And once it escaped into the wild, it very quickly spread everywhere. I mean, right now, if you go outside during the day, it's difficult to see a rubble wall that is not covered with this weed. And although it doesn't produce any seeds, it produces lots of little bulbs in the roots, which spread underneath, from underneath the soil. And it's not just difficult. I believe that right now it's impossible to eradicate, but at least we can hopefully stop it from spreading. I mean, farmers stop it from spreading in their land because it'll take over very quickly. And it's also easy to dig up, but it leaves so many of these bulbils, these little bulbs behind it, that no matter how many you take up, more will come up. I remember times when farmers used to plow their land where there was this grass, and they will leave it fallow for about a week, because then a lot of pigeons used to come and scratch the soil and eat up all the little bulbils of this plant, and so reduce the population. So there are some natural controls for it, but I don't think there's any hope left of actually eradicating or reducing its spread. It has become part of our countryside. Famous fountain grass. We have two types. This Penicitum setaceum, which we call puma here, or fountain grass, and we have the Penicitum venosum, which in English is called feathertop. In Maltese, it's often referred to as Risha acera. And they have spread all over the place. especially this Penicitum statium. Unfortunately, regrettably, it was introduced by a landscaping consortium. They thought it was very clever because people thought it was, when they first saw it, they said, oh, how wonderful, you know? And now it's spread everywhere. It's spread all along our roads. It's spread into our fields. It's spread into our valleys. There's hardly anywhere, except perhaps in some garrigue areas, where it hasn't spread. But even there, it's starting to become introduced. Some people have actually planted them themselves. And now nobody can control it. I think that the only way you can do it is by actually dedicating a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, a lot of time, a lot of equipment. I think the only way to stop it is by actually every clump that there is, you go over it, you tie it up, you bag it first, and then you cut it to stop any seeds from actually spreading. And then you pick up all the debris and you make sure you leave nothing on the ground because there's so many seeds there and it actually reproduces from underneath as well. So if we're to stop this, and we have to stop it because it's taking over terrain that was occupied by very important indigenous species. And it's a very aggressive plant. So yes, we all have to collaborate to make sure that we somehow manage to start a program to control it and to eradicate it. Pittosporum. It's also one of the plants that are considered to be a very beautiful plant. It's very glossy in summertime, so when everything is dry and all brown, this one's got glossy leaves. It produces these very fragrant bunches of flowers, and it's used even as a hedge. So it can be used as ground cover by clipping it down and keeping it very low, but it spreads because once the flowers set, the seeds set, it's got this bunch of seeds, which as soon as it opens, you've got these orange seeds on the inside. They're very gluey. They've got this resin with them, and any animal or bird that goes near them, it gets stuck to their fur or their feathers, and it's carried off and spread everywhere, and all the seeds will actually sprout. So unless we start by resisting the temptation of growing them. But if you must grow them in your patio or in your garden, make sure you don't let them spread anywhere else. Preferably, don't use them. Get rid of them. Plant something indigenous. If you don't have any ideas what to plant, ask us. We'll not only advise you, we're even ready to give you some of these indigenous plants. The castor oil tree. This is another headache because it grows very fast, produces lots of seed pods. It's very toxic. So it's really, apart from the aesthetic side, I know I've met lots of people who tell me, oh, I think it's a beautiful plant, you know. There are some people who I have exhorted to cut it down. I've even offered to go and cut it down for them, and they almost attacked me because they were protecting it like it was something valuable, you know. So if we are to stop the spread of these invasive plants, I think we have to also start a proper educational campaign to make people understand why they are such a threat to our environment. And to do that also, we have to show how our indigenous species, how beautiful they are, how useful they are, how they are part of our culture, are part of our landscape. And that these invasive plants are actually threatening all that threatening actually our identity. So even with this plant, when you're cutting it down, you have to be careful because a lot of juices from it, waxes from it, are actually toxic. So you have to wear proper protective clothing. The exudes from it are not just toxic. They even have some carcinogenic properties. So treat the tree with caution. Go prepared if you're going to eradicate it. You have to cut down the whole thing. Make sure you leave nothing behind it. There's lots of seeds which remain viable for a long time. They sprout very easily. And remember that the seeds are very, very poisonous. Scinus terebintifolius. We should not confuse this with several species which we have that are indigenous. If you look at the leaves there, it looks very similar to Pistachia lentiscus, to Pistachia terebintus, and Pistachia atlantica. Okay, so we must not confuse that with these three. Pistachia lentiscus and Pistachia terebintus are indigenous trees, and they look very similar. The berries are similar, only they're a bit smaller. The leaves are smaller as well, but they have the same shape, and the tree has the same shape. Pistachia atlantica is similar to this as well, but it's not an indigenous tree, but it has been here since the same time that the prickly pear has been here. I mean, hundreds of years. So it's basically become naturalized, but we should not confuse this with those species. This is a new species. It's called Brazilian pepper tree or false pepper tree because it produces these small berries that look like peppers. The berries are full of they're rich in oil, so a lot of birds eat them. And then, of course, they carry them elsewhere. They defecate them elsewhere, and so it spreads. Also, the berries can be spread by other means, by other animals, by people who cut the berries or branches for decorative purposes, and then they just dump them and they sprout elsewhere. So there's one particular case when we can't simply go and eradicate it. We must be able to distinguish it from the indigenous species that look very much like it. Trapeolium or the nasturtium, garden nasturtium, in Maltese called Caboccinella. And again, you can't deny it. It's a very colorful, beautiful plant. Where I see it in many gardens. It's sprouted in my garden. But it seeds very copiously. All those flowers then become bunches of seeds. I mean, it produces a compound seed. And they all sprout. And they're carried by birds. They stick to fur, and they're carried in other places, and they will sprout as soon as they fall on the ground and they get some water. They will sprout, and it grows into a large vine, spreading over a large area. So again, then when those drop the seeds, of course, they encroach on another area, and they climb over other plants as well and suffocate them. And because of the colorfulness of the flowers, they're very, very quickly pollinated, and of course, therefore, the seeds set and they multiply very quickly. But it is not it's not very problematic to control. You can cut it down, make sure you destroy it, compost it. Don't leave any parts of it because it will take root again. And the main problem is to resist the temptation to let it grow because it looks very pretty. And that brings us to the end of our little talk. I hope that what we have spoken about will stimulate further thoughts from your side, and hopefully encourage you to join our initiatives to control these alien species, to tell other people about these problems, and also to do something positive. Help us to produce more indigenous species so that we can plant more areas in our countryside with our indigenous species and therefore prevent the spread of these invasives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sammy. That was really fascinating. Thank you so much. I like the way you use the language to say that invasive species lead us away from our natural path. It's a really interesting, a good point to make, because we have a story behind our native species. So next I know everyone's probably really excited to ask Sammy lots of questions, and I've been taking a few notes of everybody's questions. I have a short presentation to give about Majjistral Park, but I'll go through it really quickly, and then we can take questions at the end. Hopefully that's okay with you, Sammy. You can have a bit of a rest now.
Thank you.
Need to find my presentation. Okay, bear with me. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just quickly, I'm going to run you through some of the invasive alien species we find at the park. So basically, we operate according to the Natura 2000 management plan. So there's a link there. I can send this to you in the chat afterwards. And we operate in accordance with that and the legislation about the invasive alien species in Malta and the European Union. And then we need to action these documents, basically, or these action plans, by having an eradication program. So here are some of the invasives we have at the park. I'm not going to go into them, as of course Sammy's just given us such a good explanation about all of them. We have the Cape sorrel, which is really common in lots of places in the park. A bit difficult to eradicate. We've been doing lots of work about the Agave. The Hottentot Fig is found mainly in the sand dunes at Golden Bay, but quite easy to pull up, luckily. We have the Eucalyptus. I'm not sure if it's the red gum. We do, I'm quite sure we have a red gum, and then I think we have the other species as well. And the Acacia in quite a few places, although we're reducing it quite a bit. The Tree of Heaven is nearly near our offices. I think the English planted a few of these species near the barracks, and we're trying to control that these as well. And then we have the giant reed, like Sammy said, a bit difficult to control. And we have quite a section of it at the sand dunes at Golden Bay. The prickly pear, which again, like Sammy was saying, we don't remove this every time. It just depends on if we think it's going to be a problem in a certain area, but otherwise, if it's going to disturb an area too much, of course we will leave it. And if it's not causing any harm. The castor oil, problematic because it's toxic and can be dangerous for people. And of course, the famous fountain grass, which our rangers have done a lot of work to remove this year. So that's a rough figure of how much was removed in 2020, and a few of the plants that were removed, and the places they were removed at. So that's Shar al-Hamra, where we have an afforestation area, the Prayet area, or Asam Barani, and Erdum Mayesa. And I just wanted to show you a few slides of, we if we remove these species, this is what we have to celebrate in the Maltese Islands. We just have some stunning plants. Lately, I've been quite excited about the southern dwarf iris flowering. Absolutely beautiful plant, which is subendemic. The sea daffodil, which flowers at Golden Bay, and which is why we try so hard to protect those sand dunes, because we only have 2% of that habitat in Malta, and that's the only place this sea daffodil grows. We have the pyramidal orchid. We also have the Maltese pyramidal, which is endemic to Malta, and then the Maltese giant fennel, which is endemic and is quite iconic in our landscape. We have the lentis, so these are just a few trees I picked. Some of the lentis and the carob are quite common to see in the park, and the sandarak we have quite a in the afforestation areas we've been planting a few of. And then these two plants, again, the Maltese spurge, endemic to Maltese Island, so it only grows here, forming these great balls of yellow. I think they're just fantastic in the landscape and would be a great plant to have in your garden at home. And the hoary rock rose, which has beautiful colours in the flowers. So yeah, just to finish off, if you have any questions, we're gonna open the discussion out to questions. And if you want to help the rangers out with removing invasive species, we're starting a volunteer program at the moment, so get in touch with us. For general queries, you can email us at info@majjistral.org or get in touch via Facebook. And I'm looking after the coordination of the volunteer program. And then we have Cami, who's become one of our rangers recently, and she's taking people out on patrols and explaining to them what we do on our patrols. So I'll stop the share and we can open the floor up to questions. I mean, I think, I don't know if we want to start off with this, but a lot of people are saying, where do we get indigenous plants from? Because the nurseries don't seem to be selling that many. I don't know if they sell any indigenous plants. And you said something about where we want to give you plants, Sammy?
Yes. Look, part of our master plan at the park is to have our nursery, okay? But even right now, we have access to indigenous plants from Ambient Malta, for example, from another group called ACT, who are propagating a lot of new plants. And we acquire them from them. With ACT, we will buy them from them because they are an NGO and they need also funds to continue their work. But if people come to us and ask us where can we obtain these indigenous plants? I want to plant some indigenous plants in my garden, or there's an area which I would like to afforest. We will help them to obtain these indigenous plants. We would first have to see where they intend to plant them to see whether it's suitable or not. But of course, we will help them to obtain these plants. And like you said, with the nurseries not only do not have enough indigenous plants, but most of the times when they do have species which are indigenous, they are importing them from abroad.
Yeah.
So their genetics, their DNA might not be, they might be the same species, but they would not be actually the Maltese indigenous species. So we would prefer that any indigenous species that are planted, especially in the wild, are obtained from stock that we are sure have been propagated from Maltese seeds or Maltese cuttings.
Yeah. I mean, people can go out and get seeds, but I think there's certain area ask for people to have permits, don't they?
Yes, yes.
And
Any intervention on the wild needs permission from AIR.
yeah,
Because first of all, you have to know what you're doing. You have to know when is the time to collect seeds. If you collect seeds prematurely, they might not be viable. If you collect seeds in a rough way, you might damage the plant. So, and of course, there are times of the year or in certain seasons when the plant is actually hosting certain insects or certain fauna, and if you go and collect seeds at that point, you might be disturbing the natural sequence of events in the wild. So yes, if you're not very well versed in this, you must consult. Of course, at the park, we will also give advice, but ERA will give its advice, and institutions like Ambient Malta and other NGOs like Nature Trust, who are well versed in this work, will also help to guide anybody who's interested in doing this work correctly and without damaging our natural environment.
Yeah, thank you. ERA is the Environment and Resource Authority. So you can look up their website. I can't remember it off heart, but if you type Environment Resource Authority Malta, it comes up online. There's also the Grow 10 Trees project. They send people seeds, and I'm pretty sure they sell trees and shrubs as well. So you can also get in touch with them. They're easy to find on Facebook, and they have their website with plenty of information.
That's right. And if they contact us, I myself can provide seeds of a nice number of indigenous trees and shrubs.
Okay.
And I also some advice on how to take cuttings, when to take cuttings, when to plant and how to plant, even how long it takes certain seeds to sprout or to germinate. We can provide a lot of this information. Hope possibly we can in the future organize another event like this where we actually give practical advice on how to propagate our indigenous species.
Somebody just requested for it to be a webinar, so that was perfect answer. I might go through some of the questions that people asked in the chat, if that's okay. So somebody wrote to us earlier a bit of a change of, well, sort of change of subject. I think we've solved that one. So they were saying that one of the worst invasive plant species is Pennicertum, as we know. What systems are being used to eradicate it? And he mentioned that he took part in one exercise and found how difficult it was to remove. So if manual uprooting is done, the process becomes too laborious. And then he suggested weed killer on Facebook, and everybody was really shocked by it, and there weren't really any answers. He's not really a supporter of herbicides, but because it's become so aggressive, then he's wondering whether this is the only option, basically, to cut the flower head and then apply herbicide.
Well, the problem is this, that with herbicides, you have to be very careful because it will leach into the ground and possibly impact on other indigenous species that are still growing around. Moreover, if it then rains, the rain will leach some of that material and take it downstream and also damage other communities further downstream. So you do really have to be very careful with herbicides, with any plant protection products. In fact, with some plants, like for example, the Agave americana, when it is used, because that is a very difficult plant to eradicate, they would wipe this herbicide onto the leaves, not spray it, so that you leave only a small amount which can't be washed off. And you have to be careful that you do it in the dry season when there is no hazard of rain. Okay, some other species which can only be controlled with herbicides, they're not sprayed. The herbicide is actually painted on them, so that you must make sure that the wind doesn't carry any of it off elsewhere, and that there is no surplus of the product which can drip off the plant and affect the communities around it. So with herbicides, yes, we have to be very, very careful. I mean, with the Pennisetum, I myself am of the persuasion that what you have to do is first, yes, contain the efflorescence, all those flowers, so bag them first, then cut them off. So when you're cutting them off, they're in the bag, and then you proceed to cut off the rest from the base. And you actually have to take up all the rhizomes. Yes, it's laborious work, it's hard work, but if you start using machines, you might be disturbing the roots of other plants. It always depends on the environment in which it exists. If it is on a traffic island, on a roundabout, okay, it's contained. There is no, or at least there's less hazard of your intervention interfering with anything else. But if it has sprouted in the wild, you must first take stock of the situation. You have to see what is growing around it, what impact your intervention is going to have on the plants around it, and then decide on the methodology. And of course, sometimes, yes, it will require drastic action. There have been occasions where you see a whole clump of this Pennisetum growing on its own. In that situation, what I would suggest is use a blowtorch. You burn off all the flowers, all the seeds, so that you can make sure that they won't sprout. Then you cut off all the rest and you bag it. And then you have to destroy it. But of course, you have to remember also that in various other countries where this Pennisetum has taken root and has spread over large areas, one of the problems it's causing is a fire hazard. Because if it takes fire, then it spreads very quickly over a large area and burns other things that might be in the same area. So using fire to control it, you must make sure also that then there isn't a lot of dry stuff around, which could also catch fire, and then you produce a very destructive fire. So each solution you find, you must really take stock of the situation properly, make sure that you are in control all the time, and you are in control of every part of that plant, so that you do not yourself cause spread of the plant. It's not straightforward. You know?
No, it's not. And every plant has its own way of dealing with it.
Yep.
So we also had, somebody said, why are these invasive species being sold at nurseries and planted on our roundabouts? Which is, I don't know if we can quite answer this question. I think it should be made illegal. It is illegal to sell Pennisetum or fountain grass now, I think.
Now, yes.
Yeah.
It should have been illegal in the first place. Yeah, I know. Well, these mistakes have been made over and over and over again over the years. I mean, unfortunately, the profit motive always wins out. Okay, and now it's going to cost a lot of taxpayers' money to first contain this contagion, and secondly, then to start limiting it and reversing it. Total eradication, I don't know. That's going to take a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
And so hopefully, once we become aware of this, of how difficult it is actually to reverse such situations, I hope it will teach us to, like I said in the beginning, prevention first. The only winning move is not to play.
And we can all do our part, can we? By
yes.
Like you said in the beginning, by not planting them, by not buying them, by not propagating them. Yeah.
And also, wherever we can, we invest in indigenous species.
Yeah.
Okay. Because that will start to persuade commercial nurseries also to start investing in them. I mean, I am quite sure that everybody who's listening to us now, if they could go to a local nursery and find wild thyme, okay, or one of these beautiful indigenous plants that we have, which are not only beautiful, they're very useful, okay? I'm sure they will go and buy them, and they're ready to pay good money for them.
Yeah.
Okay, so if these, but as in everything else in commerce, demand is the demand that decides. If there is a demand, if people keep on going to the nurseries and rather than buy the first thing they find on the shelf or the most beautiful flower they find there, they actually take the trouble to ask the people there, do you have indigenous plants? And of course, first of all, you must know what indigenous plants are available. So you must know what you are asking for as well, because sometimes they will give you something which is completely different.
Yeah. Somebody's just commented that they bought some cotton plant seeds. Cotton plants are they? They're not indigenous.
No, they're not. But they're also very popular.
Yeah.
People keep on offering me the cotton seeds, and I never plant them.
Yeah.
They make a nice, beautiful bush and a rose-like flower, but it's not only not indigenous. It is one of the invasive plants that was introduced as an agricultural crop
by the English, I think.
Yes, because cotton in those days was very useful, was in great demand. Remember, initially the British fleet was sailing ships. They needed that cotton for the sails, etc., and for the uniforms of their sailors, a huge many things, and for their industry. So cotton was for the British government a very important cash crop, but also it's a crop that destroys the fertility of the soil, and the soil takes a long time to recover. So.
Yeah, but I think it's easy. It's quite confusing for everybody because we see these species outside and we think they're part of our landscape and they're Maltese plants, so it's okay to plant them again. And somebody suggested there needs to be an educational campaign about what is indigenous and what is invasive. So I understand people see these plants in the nurseries or being sold as seeds and thinking, that's a good idea.
It takes time, it takes time and dedication. I know that in our project at Santa Maria Estate with Anzetuna, even our volunteers takes them a long time to get used to the names.
Yeah.
In fact, every time we're putting these names against these trees so visitors can understand what they're called. Some of our members keep getting them confused.
Yeah.
Even after years of participating, unless you're doing it all the time, and unless you're continuously upgrading and updating your information, yes, it can be quite confusing. especially since some Maltese names and English names and botanical names are actually contradict each other, you know. So you have to get used to the system. But if you're working with it, maybe not all the time, but consistently, regularly, you will get used to those names, and you'll start to understand their significance, because each name has a story behind it. Like we were saying before, why is that acacia called like that, and why is that casuarina called that? I mean, can you imagine that a tree would get its name from the cassowary, and its second name from a completely different animal, a horse? So the casuarina, but its first name from a bird and second name from a horsetail. So I mean, when you start looking at these things, then they start fitting in, and you start realizing how the story of our indigenous species is so rich. It reflects our ancient cultures, and it reflects how we have developed as well, even socially. You start connecting it with certain idioms, certain proverbs, you know. So it can be a very, very interesting and very gratifying exercise.
Definitely. Someone's asking about olive trees, which are definitely indigenous, one of our important trees.
Yes.
There are different species, aren't there? So again, with trees, it's good to propagate from our native seeds.
Definitely. And this becomes very important because, well, about 20 years ago, it started becoming fashionable to plant olive trees, mainly because we had somebody starting an olive press, and therefore, if you had olives, you can press them, you can have your own oil. And so people started learning quite a bit about oil, and quite a bit about olives as well, preserving olives. So of course, the fastest thing is to import the olive trees. And we got quite a few olive trees from Spain, from Italy, from Greece. But now we have become aware that we have several actual Maltese endemic species of olives. So the first one we learned about was the Bidnia, right? Talbidni. Then we had the Perla Maltese, the white olive, which is as a table olive. Now we know that there is another species which has been called Talmalti. And we are also testing, DNA testing other specimens, because we suspect that there are yet other Maltese endemic species which we haven't discovered yet. So if you can get the Maltese endemic species, they have an advantage because they are species that developed here. They acclimatize themselves to the local conditions. They can take the aridity, the dry summers, the calcareous soil. And most importantly, because they grow on calcareous soil, it means that their olives and their olive oil is very low in acid. The acidity of our olive oil is unparalleled. I mean, when we take our oil elsewhere, they say, where did you get this oil from? Because we get something like just 0.3% acidity in our olive oil, where the Italians really struggle to get anything below 3%.
Wow.
You know, so our olive oil is really gold, you know. So if you can get the Maltese indigenous, in fact, endemic olive trees, use them. After all, they are very good olives. They produce fantastic oil, even for the taste, you know, let alone for the actual chemical quality.
They're pretty special, really, that we have these endemic species on our islands.
Exactly. Well, we have them because we have been isolated for so long.
Yeah.
And therefore, they have developed in a different way from other trees in mainland Italy or in Spain or in the Maghreb or in Greece, because we are an island, and therefore we had our species have developed separately. We have discovered recently that even certain species I'm not talking about olives now, but even other indigenous species, which are identical to the same species, say in Sicily or in Puglia, the DNA has been found to be different.
Mm-hmm.
So just because I want to plant a myrtle tree, okay, a rehan, and I can't get it locally or don't know yet where to get it locally, doesn't mean that I should order it from a nursery and he gets it from Sicily. I should ask again to see where I can get it from Malta, and you can get it here. And it's not that difficult to grow. It produces a lot of seeds. So with a bit of instruction on how to stratify the seeds and to prepare so that it sprouts, you can grow your own myrtle tree.
Yep, definitely. And Dr. Alfred Baldacchino has a really good book in Maltese about how to propagate trees. There isn't everything in it, but there's really detailed information, and some people prefer it being in Maltese. So
yes, it's right behind me on those shelves.
in amongst all your other books. There's just one last question that I've written down, and then I don't know if anybody else wants to ask questions. We've had a record 2-hour talk almost, so we'll try and wrap up soon, but I think everyone's just really interested. They're asking about freesias, which I've been seeing a few of on the border of the park. It's obviously an escapee, but they're saying, is it invasive? I think it is invasive, but I don't know if it's on the list of invasives.
No, it is. Listen, the list of invasives includes only those species that have already spread quite considerably and are threatening our indigenous communities. With something like freesia, the freesia produces another bulb. Okay, so it will spread very, very slowly. It can spread, but it will spread a few inches every year.
Oh, okay.
It's not going to spread several meters every year. Okay, so if we needed to contain it, it would not be problematic to contain it. The serious ones, the hazardous ones, are the ones which, like the fountain grass, okay, will be very difficult to eradicate. And you'll find that a list of those invasive species in those documents which I had in the second slide.
Yeah.
Okay, you can consult those. Those documents will teach you a lot about both our biodiversity and our biodiversity program, a national biodiversity program, and also about the invasive alien trees or species that are of concern. And I have mentioned all of them. There are a few others I know of which were not in that list, and probably that list will be updated as the years go by. Hopefully it will be updated downwards.
Yeah.
That each year we start to find that even those on the list are now better managed. But we never know. We have to be vigilant about this.
And this is a European-wide issue, isn't it? It's not just Malta, of course. Fountain grass, everybody's really worried about it across Europe. So, yeah.
Not just across Europe. I mean, it's become a problem in the United States, in Australia, in Africa.
Really?
Yep. Yes. In America and Australia, it's a fire hazard because it occupies large swathes of land, and if you have a thunderstorm and you have lightning, it just ignites it, and then you have a wildfire.
God.
And the fire does not restrict it. It will recover.
Yeah, I thought
it will spread the fire. It will spread the fire to other trees and to other plants, and it itself will recover.
Yeah, not a good species to have
No.
somewhere hot like here. I think, well, that's all the questions I have written down. I don't know if anybody has any other questions. Everybody's been saying in the chat, thank you very much. They really enjoyed it and it was really interesting. So thank you, Sammy.
I'm very glad about that. I hope that we will see them at the park and that they will get interested and get the inclination to come and join us in the work that we're doing there.
Yes,
And
definitely.
thank you very much, Tamsin,
You're
for
welcome.
this initiative and for the very, very good and hard work that you're doing in the park.
Thank you. Yes, people still saying thank you very much. Everyone's very polite and thankful.
Don't be polite with the invasive tree.
No, don't do that. I think if anybody is okay with that, doesn't have any more questions, of course, yeah, like Sammy said, do get in touch with us. I put my email address in the chat, walks@majjistral.org. I think maybe Sammy and I might start a little project helping out with helping people to plant more indigenous species. So we'll have a chat about that afterwards. So yes, if anybody else doesn't have any questions, shall we end this here?
Right. Thank you very much for your participation. And until next time.
Yes, definitely.
In the meantime, stay well and take care.
Yes, thank you, Sammy, and take care too. Take care, everybody.
Night.
Good night. Have a nice evening.
Good night.
Good night.